Well, today we're going to talk about a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart, having to do with science and miracles. Not that something you hear all that often, but we're going to talk about the fact that everyone believes in miracles. People like to represent that they don't. They believe in objective reality and they don't require miracles, and that's just for people who have religious biases or are ignorant. But as we'll see, the two major worldviews that we're going to look at today all require miracles. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at what's involved here. So where are we going today? Well, we're going to talk about two different worldviews. The two that we're going to discuss is the secular worldview, which is the one that you see most in the media, taught in our schools, and the other is going to be the biblical worldview. And then after we contrast those, we're going to discuss the nature of miracles. What is a miracle? What's the definition of a miracle? Because that's important to keep in mind when we look at how these worldviews claim to operate. Then I'm going to go through what I call 5 secular miracles. So they're associated with the secular worldview, but papered over, denied, or kind of, what do you want to call it? Just treated in a way that people don't really look at it very closely. And then we're going to see that both worldviews require miracles, and therefore all the people that believe in these two different worldviews, which is the majority of people, believe in one of these worldviews or the other, then they all have that in common, that they're believing in miracles. So first, let's look a little bit about my background. I was raised with a secular worldview in a non-religious household. I was raised in the public schools where the secular worldview is taught about evolutions of fact and so on. And so by the time I got to high school, I was pretty ardent opposition to Christianity and the Bible. But then later in life, I ended up embracing a biblical worldview at age 34 in 1993. So I was trained at school. I got a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering in 1979 from the University of Washington, and I worked in the field of engineering, obtained my professional engineer's license in 1985, and I've worked in the field of engineering, doing hardware and software engineering for over 40 years now. And then partway along the way, in 2004, I attended seminary and for 4 years, and obtained a Doctor of Theology through Tyndale Seminary in association with Louisiana Baptist Theological Seminary. So I've got this background in applied science, engineering, but I've also done a significant amount of study in theology and the Bible for over 30 years as a Christian. So the two worldviews we're going to look at here I've got in this chart. The first one is the secular worldview, which I think most people are familiar with, and then the second one is the biblical worldview, which Christians are familiar with, and some other people as well. So I've got each row in the chart contrasts some aspect of the worldview. So let's just go through these different contrasts and give ourselves an overview of what we're talking about here. So contrast in row A, the first row. The secular worldview, of course, begins the universe with the Big Bang cosmology. That's how the cosmos is said to come into effect, is through this big explosion, if you will. And the biblical worldview, of course, has the creation account where God, an agent outside of the universe, creates the universe. The second row is B, product of chance, is the secular worldview, says that, hey, this Big Bang, there is no intelligence behind it. It just happened. It's the product of chance, and everything that flows from it up until the development of the human brain, or brains in general, through evolutionary processes, all that led up to that was unguided by any intelligence. Of course, the biblical worldview takes the opposite view, says that we're here by the product of a super intellect, that all of the process that led to where we are is involved from the hand of God. Row number C, because of how the secular worldview sees the world coming about, essentially the universe and the people in it are purposeless. There's no ultimate purpose. Yeah, you can concoct some kind of purpose to motivate your life for a while, but in general, when you really get boiled down to it, existence is meaningless. It has no guiding purpose. The biblical worldview, of course, says that we're here by design. There's a purpose to us being here. There's a purpose to the universe, a purpose to the earth, a purpose to each individual life, and that it all is tied to the intention of the super intellect which created everything in the first place. Row D, the secular worldview says that materialism is all there is. Whatever you can see, touch, smell, taste, or detect with some sort of sensor, infrared, X-ray, ultraviolet, those are the physical parts of the universe, the atomic structure, etc., and that's all there is. The biblical worldview says no. There's also a spiritual realm that's beyond the material and also beyond the universe. There's the super intellect, God. Row E, science will eventually explain everything, is what the secular worldview tells us. So even though we don't understand everything now, as science chips away at the ignorance and the darkness, it will eventually fill in the entire worldview in detail of how things came to be, and we'll find out that there was no external agent acting on any of this. And of course, the biblical worldview says no, science has limits. Science can't go beyond time. It can't be outside of space. It can't study events like singularities, which are basically situations where mathematics and the laws of physics fall apart. And also, science can't predict the future. I mean, it can in general sense that say that entropy is increasing and the universe is expanding, so they can look at what's now or what appeared in the past and kind of predict the future, that it'll stay the same. But it can't predict the future in the sense of detailed history or prophecy, which the biblical worldview says that the God who's outside the universe has provided information on some of those things. So the secular worldview in row F likes to pride itself as it's based on observational facts. As one TV show, the policeman used to say, "Just the facts, ma'am." So the secular worldview is this idea that they're objective, they're realists, and then they portray the biblical worldview as being kind of more of a fantasy. And of course, the biblical worldview does require and acknowledge miracles, creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, creation of the virgin birth, right? That's not something you see every day. The resurrection, several resurrections, the key one being Jesus Christ, of course, and then prophecy, that the Old Testament and the New Testament predict events that either have been fulfilled or will be fulfilled in the future, because there's information coming from an intelligent agent outside the material universe, who's not bound by science or space, space or time. Row G. Again, the secular worldview prides itself as science. You've seen those posters, "Science is real." And so it's the real reality. Other people who have other worldviews, they're practicing religion, which is the realm of faith. It's not really tied to reality. So you can have your own faith and believe whatever you want. If you want to believe there's pink elephants on your lawn, that's fine. Just don't bring it into my classroom. Row H. And this is an interesting one. The secular worldview believes that man is born good, or at least neutral, and any kind of problems that develop with children or with adults have to do with inequality, lack of justice, poor environment, poor nutrition, health, events that they experience. It's all environmental that impinges upon the good or neutral man that is born. And of course, the biblical worldview says no. Look at the news. Man is born sinful, and he has a bias against God and a bias against truth and a bias toward himself, and to optimize things for himself, basically selfishness. Row I, the secular worldview says that, hey, since this is all science and reality, we can teach this in schools. But the biblical worldview, of course, since it's kind of a fairy tale, it's banned from schools. After all, those nuts out there who are Christians, they believe in miracles, and we don't want them teaching miracles in the classroom. And then row J, this one's pretty obvious. The secular worldview is promoted by the media. So if you go to most of the major websites or news outlets, you're going to hear the secular worldview promoted, and in general, the biblical worldview is going to be ridiculed by the media and in the classroom, especially at the university level. So now we need to consider what is a miracle. So here I've drawn from a dictionary definition and highlighted part of it. It's an event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws. It's therefore considered to be the work of divine agency. So notice the part I've highlighted, because I want us to keep this in mind as we go through this discussion. An event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws. And my point in this presentation is we're going to run into aspects of the secular worldview which rely on events that are not explicable by natural or scientific laws and have never been observed. And therefore they qualify to meet this definition of miracle. So, lacking a viable materialistic explanation, many conclude miracles provide evidence of divine intervention. And one of the things about miracles is they can't be investigated using the scientific method, because the scientific method requires repeatability. You basically need to be able to put forth a hypothesis and then try to disprove it through experiment. And that's something that miracles aren't subject to because they don't tend to repeat. So now we look at another related term. What does supernatural mean? And it's a manifestation or event attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding of the laws of nature. And you can see the supernatural in the definition, beyond scientific understanding of nature, beyond nature, supernatural, above or beyond that which naturally occurs. So supernatural is very similar to miracle in that they are things that can't be investigated by the scientific nature because they're unrepeatable, and so you can't test them. And again, we will see that in the secular worldview there are a number of things that are beyond scientific understanding of the laws of nature, and therefore I'm going to claim they qualify as miracles. So keep those definitions in mind as we move forward. So now let's look at 5 secular miracles. I'm calling them secular miracles. That seems like an oxymoron, but I think we'll see it's true. And many people fail to realize that the secular worldview, as promoted by mainstream science and the media and taught in public schools, requires at least 5 miracles. I would say there's more, but there's 5 very clear ones that we're going to look at today. And so what we'll find is that the secular worldview and the biblical worldview both require miracles. So we'll start at the beginning, which is this whole idea that something came from nothing. So in order to discuss this a little more and shed some light on it, we need to kind of do a little review, a summary view of the first 2 laws, or at least 2 laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. And this law underlines the principle that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. And what they mean by that is that in the conservation of energy, energy can change form between mass and energy, like in Einstein's equation, the perfect conversion of energy to mass and back and forth is E equals mc squared, where the speed of light is in the equation. But the basic idea is you can take mass and convert it to energy. You can take energy and convert it the other way through that equation. by some means or some form, but you can't create or destroy this idea of the conservation of energy. And so this is a law that has always, it's a law because it can't be broken. So unlike human laws that can be broken, the physical laws of the universe can't be broken, or else they are called a miracle. So there's the first law. The second law of thermodynamics has to do with this idea of entropy, or the tendency toward randomness or dissipation of heat, where heat naturally flows from hot to cold, and entropy, a measure of disorder, tends to increase in isolated systems. This law explains why processes are irreversible and defines the arrow of time. And some quick-witted people have observed this is also the process that explains why your garage is a mess that it is, might be the mess that it is, a tendency toward randomness. So let's look a little bit more now at aspects of these two laws. Well, in the origin of the universe, aside from a cyclical model, which is kind of a combination of these two models, these are the two scenarios that are most often associated with the universe. The first one, if we look at the duration column, or row number 1, the universe had a beginning, and this is both these worldviews hold the view that the universe had a beginning. So if the universe had a beginning, then the first law is broken because energy and matter are created. They haven't always existed. But the second law is preserved because entropy is increasing as the universe runs down. So as the universe expands and as the energy dissipates, we see this idea, or as it spreads out, we see this idea that entropy is increasing. So right now, when we look out in at the universe, the first and second law hold, but the only reason the first law holds is because we're not considering the very beginning of the universe where the first law was broken, because somehow the energy and matter were created if the universe had a beginning, and that's a violation of the first law. So what about if the universe has always existed? Well, now we have the opposite case. The first law is preserved because energy and matter always existed. There's never been a point in time where they haven't existed. But on the other hand, we have this problem where if the universe has always existed, it would have run down by now. And it hasn't run down. There are still localized areas of energy that haven't, the heat death of the universe hasn't happened. So it hasn't always existed. So there you have the first law okay, but the second law broken. So the point I'm making here is that these laws, and looking at these laws, gives you this idea about the laws apply, the first and second law apply in our universe today because the assumption is that it had a beginning, so the second law holds, and that it's a closed system, that after the first law was broken at the creation event, or the Big Bang, thereafter energy and matter were not created or destroyed. And so these laws are laws because in our present situation they are seen to hold. But you can see that depending on which way the universe, the view of how the universe has existed, you end up breaking one of the laws or the other. And it's the first law that both of these worldviews break. So the inference is that since both the first and second laws hold in our present reality, the system must be open. At some point it must have been affected by something or someone outside the box, outside of the material universe. And of course the Big Bang says that, well, their best explanation, they hand wave and they have a number of different things they suggest. But the most popular one is that people have really glommed onto is this idea of quantum fluctuations offered as the possible origin of the Big Bang. But to have a quantum fluctuation, you have to have energy, you have to have a vacuum, and the quantum fluctuations require that space and time already exist, except that space-time doesn't exist prior to the Big Bang. At least that's what it says. So this fact that something came from nothing in both worldviews is a miracle, but I'm calling the secular worldview requires a secular miracle. It's a miracle that's not only a miracle, but there's nothing behind it. There's no intelligence, no purpose, no driving force. It just happens. But notice that this event of the creation of time, space, energy, matter from nothing is an event that's not explicable by natural or scientific laws, and therefore it qualifies as secular miracle number one. So now let's look at another miracle, miracle number two, cosmic inflation. So what is cosmic inflation? Well, this map I've got here, or this picture, is a projection. It's a lot like a Mercator projection. It's a mathematical projection of a spherical measurement made out of the background radiation coming from between the stars and the galaxies. And what it's supposed to be measuring, or what it is measuring, is the background temperature or energy level, if you will, of the farthest reaches of the universe that we can receive energy from. And then what's being shown here in these different colors is the variation in that temperature, that background temperature. And even though the variations are highlighted by these colors, it turns out that the temperature across this entire survey is extremely the same. It's very close to the same number across everywhere that they look, across in between these. So if you look right at a galaxy, of course, you're going to get the energy from the galaxy. But if you measure between observable galaxies and stars, you're looking now presumably at radiation that's just coming from space, from the very back of the space. Of course, there's the argument, how many galaxies and stars are there and how far does it go, so that how can you actually find a place to measure that doesn't have a galaxy or star, but that's a whole different matter. So anyway, when you look at this chart, what you see is they come away with this idea that behind the observable stars and galaxies, it's not behind the universe, because the universe is all that there is, but at the farthest reaches of the universe, the temperatures match within a very, 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 very close tolerance. And so the question is, well, how do you explain that it's so even of a temperature? So this cosmic microwave background is a faint glow between the observable stars and galaxies from distant space, but behind the stars and galaxies. And it's got this extremely even temperature. And here's the key. It's only possible, or it's thought to only be possible, if regions presently separated by huge distances were originally near one another at a uniform shared temperature. So the idea here is that if you were to take a hot and if you take a glass of water out of the refrigerator and you put it in a room, over time, the cold temperature in the glass gets influenced by the warmer air in the room, and the air around the glass decreases in temperature, whereas the water in the glass increases in temperature until they stabilize. So the temperature around the glass and the temperature of the water in the glass eventually reach the same temperature, and they match exactly. That's the idea. So that for that equalization process to happen, the warm air in the room and the cold water in the glass have to be adjacent to one another. You have glass, of course, separating them, but that glass itself comes to that same temperature as well. So the uniformity of the universe, known as the flatness problem, is explained through this idea of cosmic inflation, so that even a sudden and very rapid expansion of space occurred during the earliest moments of the Big Bang. So one way to think about it is you have this infinitesimal dense universe that's in a very small space, and of course everything's all together, and so it's the same temperature because it's adjacent, physically adjacent. And then during the Big Bang, these areas are pushed at enormous distances apart, but since they started together, they have the same initial temperature, uniform in every direction that it goes out from there. So what's the implication? So let's take a look at this chart of the timeline of the Big Bang. So this is straight from Wikipedia. the secular holy grail of truth. So in this, if you take a look at this on the left side, you'll see the quantum fluctuations right here, right at this bright spot. Well, I got 2 pointers. But anyway, the spot on the left where the inflation occurs is right above the quantum fluctuation. So first is the quantum fluctuation, which is secular miracle number 1. Then you got this cosmic inflation. And you'll notice in this diagram, you'll see the colored disc we saw in a previous slide back a couple slides is now rotated and inserted into this cornucopia, or this cone that's a picture of Big Bang expansion. And so what they're trying to show there is the cosmic background radiation being very even within a very tight margin is the explanation for this inflation, and it's revealing an afterglow light pattern of that hyperfast inflation. So why do they call it inflation? Well, they call it inflation because we'll find out that the universe expands in this initial period at a speed that's super fast, way faster than the rest of the time. And you can see that in the diagram. The initial base or left-hand side of this, if you think of it as a cup turned sideways, the base of the cup comes out to its radius very quickly, and then it expands relatively slowly for the rest of the taper. And of course, that relatively slowly is actually a super high speed too. It's just that the inflation is an enormously high speed. Well, how high speed is it? Well, cosmic inflation is said to expand space by a factor of the order of 1,026, anyway, over 1,000, in a time on the order of 10 to the minus 36 or 10 to the minus 32 seconds. Well, that is an enormous speed. So today's computers, if you look at the clocking that takes place of some of the microprocessors and some of the things that are taking place, they're on the order, at least a few years ago, of nanoseconds, 10 to the minus 9. And maybe nowadays some of the stuff's picoseconds, 10 to the minus 12. But we're talking 10 to the minus 36. So we're talking, an order of 20 magnitudes faster than computers can run just single little clock cycles today. So it's enormously fast. A very short period where it expands over 1,000 times. And they say this took place at a 10 to the minus 37 seconds after when the Big Bang occurs. As it's expanding for a short period, 10 to the minus 32 seconds into that expansion period, there's this phase transition that causes this cosmic inflation, during which the universe grew exponentially. And notice my highlighted part of this. Now, this explanation is straight out of the Wikipedia. So this is the secular gospel about what took place here. And it's basically, they do mention, by the way, that it's unconstrained by the light speed invariance. That's kind of a nice science way of saying that it broke the law of the speed of light, and temperatures dropped by a factor of 100,000. But I want you to notice the yellow part especially. Has anyone ever measured anything going faster than the speed of light? No. Is the Einstein's physics, does it predict that things can go faster than the speed of light? No. Is this something that can be measured experimentally? No. Can it be repeated? No. Has it ever been observed? No. This is a secular miracle. It's an event that's not explicable by natural or scientific laws. It breaks every law we know about, and it's pure conjecture. So it qualifies as a miracle, except it's more of a miracle than the biblical miracle because not only did it take place, there's no purpose or reason behind it except some physical laws that we don't even know exist. At least in the biblical miracles, there's a knowledgeable intelligence. Also, pay attention, the secular origin story also has a light travel time difficulty. People often make fun of the biblical account of a recent creation, partly because of this idea that light came from a long ways away and can only travel at light speed, and therefore the universe must be 13.7 billion years old. And that's called the light travel time difficulty, and it is a difficult thing to understand or explain, and there's various proposals put forth by people who hold the biblical worldview about the possible ways this might have happened, having to do with time dilation and etc. But notice here that we who uphold the biblical worldview aren't the only ones that struggle with the idea that the speed of light today versus what we have in our worldview don't jibe perfectly without some form of complicated considerations. And this is true of the secular model just as well as the biblical one. So that's miracle number 2. So now let's move on to miracle number 3, which is the origin of life. How did life arise from non-life? So this is abiogenesis, which is the idea that the natural process by which life arises from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds, is this idea. So somehow you have to start with simple organic compounds, and then something happens that's an unguided process, natural process. There's no intelligence involved, no technology, just accident, and then life arises. So it says here that the prevailing scientific hypothesis is that the transition from non-living to living entities on Earth was not a single event, but a process of increasing complexity involving the formation of a habitable planet, the prebiotic synthesis of organic molecules, molecule self-replication, self-assembly, autocatalysts, and the emergence of cell membranes. Notice in yellow, the transition from non-life to life has never been observed experimentally, but many proposals have been made for different stages of the process. So this is a lot like the Wizard of Oz. Don't look behind the curtain. The transition from non-life to life has never been observed experimentally. It's never been observed in any way, shape, or form. It's never been observed. In fact, it's a biological law at this point that inert matter does not spontaneously, by any process, even with processes with all the intelligence that humanity can muster, come to produce life from non-life. And notice in this whole description as well, it mentions that it's an unguided sort of thing. And all along the way you see these key tip-offs. For example, the transition from non-living to living was not a single event. How do we know that? We don't know that. It's a process of increasing complexity, so the assumption is that simple things automatically became more complex. And notice that it also involves synthesis of molecules, and then once you have the molecules, you have self-replication. Well, how does that happen? And self-assembly. The self in those two is a real troublesome part of this whole thing. So, but don't worry about it too much, because many proposals have been made for different stages of the process, and we assume from descriptions like this and what we're seeing in the secular portrayal of this that the problem has almost been solved. There's just a few details to work out. But in fact, there's been no real progress in 70 years. So the Miller-Urey experiment was done in 1952. And this is what I was raised on in school. I was born in 1957. And by the time I got to the point where they start teaching evolution, this is the explanation for chemical evolution. In other words, how did we go from inorganic, how did we go from chemistry that's not life to chemistry that is life? And of course, there's a huge difference between the two, which isn't obvious if you just think about chemistry, but it turns out that chemistry that's the basis of life involves information, which we'll get to later, which isn't a requirement for natural chemistry that has to do with things like carbon or oxygen or helium or whatever, inorganic. So over 70 years, what we'll see is that no substantial progress has been made in support of this hypothesis. In fact, we're still clueless. So this is a quote from a book titled The Mystery of Life's Origin by a number of different authors who contributed to it. But this quote is from Dr. James Tour, who is a very sharp synthetic chemist. He says that 2/3 of a century since the 1952 Miller-Urey experiment, where some racemic amino acids were formed from small molecules in an electrical discharge, the world is no closer to generating life from small molecules, or any molecules for that matter, than it was in 1952. One could argue that origin of life research is even more befuddled now than it was in 1952, since more questions have evolved than answers, and the voluminous new data regarding the complexity within a cell makes the target much more daunting than it used to be. Notice here he's mentioning that when Miller-Urey did their experiment, the complexity of the cell was not known. Now we know that the cell is actually very complicated, and therefore for it to arise by chance is even more daunting than it was thought to be at the time of that experiment. He goes on to say, the origin of life research has not made any progress whatsoever in addressing the fundamental questions of life's origin. 2/3 of a century, and all that has been generated are more suggestions on how life might have formed. Suggestions that really show how life probably did not form. Nothing even resembling a synthetic cellular structure has arisen from its independent components, let alone a living cell. Not even close. So I want you to think through that. What do we know about life from non-life? Has it ever been observed? No. The transition from non-life to life has never been observed experimentally. It says on the front of Wikipedia. And I don't know why they say experimentally. It's never been observed, period. Even the experiments, and the experiments are often biased because they include information, they include special limits and special optimizations that are made by the experimenters to try to bring this about. So if you think about the unguided process on the early Earth, there's no human scientists there to try and set up beakers and different kinds of processes and different chemistry to isolate out the particular things they're trying to produce and then protect them from being lost again by interacting with other reagents in the system. So a lot of these experiments, including the Miller-Urey one, are actually optimized by intelligence. And of course, the claim that this happened without intelligence is violated by how those experiments are set up. So it's kind of like when people say, when God creates and then people say, well, this stuff occurred on its own, and God says, well, go get your own dirt. So there's this whole issue where this also occurs when you look at some of the programming claims that people write programs that simulate what they think is evolutionary process, and they show how evolution leads to these complex results. But when you get down to looking at these experiments, you find that the intelligence of the programmer or the intelligence of the scientists running the experiment are used in such a way to optimize the results. And of course, that violates one of the rules of the game, which is you have to get it to happen without intelligence. So I'm going to claim here that life from non-life is a secular miracle. It's an event that's not explicable by natural or scientific laws. It's never been seen to occur, and as far as we know, it never has occurred. That's our third miracle. So now let's look at miracle number 4, biological evolution. So before we look at this in more detail, we need to think about how this term evolution is used. And one of the things if you start paying attention to the term evolution, it's bandied about in a lot of different ways. It's used in ways that are all different. And often what happens is the use of it in ways that are provable and observable is ported over into settings where it's then applied to things that have never been observed and are not provable. And because people think evolution is a fact, then they just assume that it's factual in situations where the evidence is lacking. So let's look at 4 different usages of the term evolution. In the first row, I have unlimited change in response to intelligent intervention. So this is the case where something changes over time from simple to highly complex, and there's no limits to how far that change can go. And it's guided by intelligent intervention. So I've been involved in a lot of this over the years. That's what engineering is all about. So we look at like the evolution of flight. We start with like a rudimentary airplane, and then over time it becomes a more sophisticated airplane. Then we develop the notion of a jet instead of a propeller, and then maybe the jet, along with other things, comes into developing rockets, or maybe rockets are in front of jets, depending on what you think a jet or a rocket is. But eventually you get to a spaceship, which is essentially a rocket that can fly in outer space, right? So as you go along, you see this gets more and more sophisticated, more and more complex, more and more capable, and it's driven along by intelligent intervention, that is, engineering and science and technology. Do we observe the evolution of flight? Absolutely. So let's look at the second law, or the second row. So this is limited change in response to intelligent intervention. So like the first row, we have intelligence involved in the process. This would apply to things like breeding dogs, breeding horses, plants. And so what you're doing there is you're combining genetics from different lines that you're trying to emphasize, and you're just trying to suppress characteristics you don't want in your animal line, and you're trying to emphasize the ones you do. And through that process, you end up with different breeds of dogs, different types of horses that have different characteristics, and different sorts of plants, new roses, etc. But notice that there's a limit in how far this can go. Dogs are still dogs, horses are still horses, and you can breed a set of horses, you can breed them till the cows come home, and they're never going to become dogs, or vice versa. And that's because this, even though intelligence is involved, the material you're working with, which is the genetics within the animal, has limits to how far you can modify it or influence it, how far it can go. It can't transition to a whole different animal. Do we see this? Absolutely. So let's look at the third row. Limited change in response to environmental pressure. So this would be some of the most common environmental examples that are brought up as proving evolution, right? The evolution of Darwin's finches, where their ability to fly, the size of their beaks, the way they use tools, and how they eat, things like that change as they're put under various environmental pressure. Another example would be blind cavefish. Fish that had eyes at one time, and then they ended up being stuck in areas of darkness where there's no light, and mutation caused the loss of the ability to create an eye, and so now they live without eyes. And since they don't have eyes, well, let's put it this way, eyes only provide a benefit for them when there's light. Since there's no light and they don't have eyes, they don't suffer from lack of that capability. And then at the same time, having a complex item like an eye could be infected. It's potentially something that could be more likely to have disease, and so the blind cavefish maybe are better able to survive without that feature because the feature is not needed in the environment. But once again, once you remove the environmental pressure, the particular animal can only move so far in coming back to what it had before. So in the case of like a cavefish, for example, if you lose the ability for the fish to produce an eye, it's not going to, you can't take them back into light and then they're going to have an eye again. They've lost that capability, that richness of genetic expression that was there. Do we see this? Yes. And one of the things to notice now is very often in this discussion of evolution, examples in the third row are then used to support the fourth row, which has never been observed and is a whole different matter. So it's a bait and switch situation where limited variation in species due to environmental pressure is then used as examples to say, well, radical microbes to man evolution. So the fourth row is about radical change as one kind of animal becomes another kind of animal, and then another kind of animal, and then another kind of animal, and we move from the biogenesis. You've got this situation where life forms on its own, supposedly by a spark. You get amino acids, from that. Then you get proteins and so forth, and then somehow you get a cell, and then the cell somehow learns how to divide and replicate, and then you get more complicated animals, and it works its way up until you finally arrive at the apex of the animal kingdom on Earth, which is humanity. And I'm going to claim it's not really the animal kingdom. Man is separate from the animal kingdom, but people have described this aptly as from goo to you via zoo. And in this particular change, function and complexity continually increase. And notice there's no intelligent agent involved. So this is like the third row where there's no intelligent agent involved, and the presumption is it's only environmental pressure, natural selection and survival of the fittest that is driving this. But again, there's also no limit in what this can achieve. And in fact, if you read some of the standard textbooks on this, you'll find out that things like the eye, which is a very sophisticated function and structure, evolved independently in different lines of evolution. So apparently, when you have enough time and you have chance and you have environmental pressure, the eye is just something that's just bound to pop up. It pops up in all these different places and they're all very similar, but it just happens. You just can't prevent the eye from coming up from random chance. It's pretty amazing, the claims that are made, and people don't really think that much about them. So now let's discuss, as a starting point to really look at this a little bit more, let's discuss a question that has gone down through the ages. It's a question that you've probably heard yourself on different occasions. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? So that's kind of a humorous question that's been put up through the ages, and this is an art piece that's down in Oregon that shows this idea of the chicken and the egg. And I want you to notice something about this. This is not just bringing up the question of the chicken and the egg. If you look at the very bottom of it, what's first there on the pedestal? Well, it's the egg. So this is a very clever piece of artwork, and it's bringing up the whole idea of chickens and eggs, which came first, but it's also making a statement about evolution. At the bottom, it's telling us that the egg came first. Of course, the biblical account says the chicken came first. So what's at the bottom of this discussion about the chicken and egg? And it's kind of a lighthearted, funny discussion. But it's the basic idea that there's an interdependence between the chicken and the egg that is difficult to untangle. So the chicken says to the egg, you won't survive without me, because if the egg is just sitting there without someone sitting on it, the temperature of the egg will drop to a point where it just goes out into the environment, and the chicken that's trying to be born inside the egg will die. Then there's a matter that once the chicken in the egg gets to the point where it's got to peck out of the egg, it can do that, but then it's totally it's not viable. It can't live on its own. It needs to be fed and cared for by an adult chicken. So the chicken says to the egg, hey, you won't survive without me, therefore I came first. Well, the egg has a ready reply. The egg says, you can't even exist without me, because if I didn't come first, how did you arise? Because the egg is how the chicken comes to be, and without the egg there is no chicken, so you can't exist without me. So that's the kind of the back and forth about which came first, the chicken or the egg. But it actually belies, a lot bigger question that has to do with this idea of which of them comes first. And environmentalists, or I mean not environmentalists, evolutionists are always going to tell us that it's the egg. And you say, really? Are they going to say that? I'm going to say, well, yeah, they are going to say that. Here's a quote from SpiritAndTruth.org, and they assert that the egg came first. This is a riddle we can unscramble with the tools of science. Notice that the tools of science are so powerful, they can unscramble these ages-long questions. More specifically, the principles of evolutionary biology. And then it goes on to say, at some point, a different kind of egg began to evolve. They're talking about different kinds of eggs. And so as you go along, you start with a simple egg, of course, they assume, which is an egg that we've never seen. And then they go along and they say at some point a different kind of egg began to evolve. And then we're still not sure of exactly when this happened. And also they're not sure of how or why. Our best guess is ... So I encourage you to go read the rest of this article on their website. But what you'll see is it's a load of hand waving. They don't have a clue how this first egg came to be. But of course, this riddle is unscrambled by the tools of science. Well, this explanation doesn't involve any science. It's pure conjecture. But there's an underlying assumption to all of this evolutionary biology, which has been shown false, which is that the first life was ultra simple and that it became more complex as it evolved in stages. But we now know that the precursor to the evolutionary egg, the so-called simple cell, is anything but simple. And here's a short quote from Michael Denton, The Miracle of the Cell. He says, in terms of compressed complexity, cells are without peer in the material world, actualized or imagined. There is likely far more complexity still to uncover. So you can go out for yourself and read about what's been discovered in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years about the cell. And what you'll find is that the simple cell is not simple. It's very sophisticated. It's packed with, it's like a complex factory. It's been likened to a huge factory that's more complex and extensive and varied than anything humanity has even imagined or even certainly come up with. It's more on the, if you look at what they're building now with fusion reactors, places where they're trying to get fusion to occur, the simple cell's more complex than a fusion reactor. So this idea that it's all simple and it just gets more complex on its own is highly questionable, has never been demonstrated, and it's all just a so fairy tale is essentially what we're talking about. So there's other problems with biological evolution as well. If you look at the fossil record, it's been quite some time since Darwin, over 150 years. Missing links are still missing in the vast majority of assumed animal sequences, including that which leads to man. Sure, they come up with some new Australopithecus this or that. They find some bones and put them together and say, well, this one must have been in the sequence leading to man. And then there's these big news headlines all around the world that reinforce the idea that we came here from the apes. And then what happens is a year or two later in the journals and the scientific publications, they admit that, no, actually this one here, after, they debate back and forth, they come out and say, well, this one really isn't in the line leading to man. And when they do that, of course, that's not covered in the media. So it just goes on and on and on. Also notice that random mutations overwhelmingly degrade living systems. And there's a recent book that's been put out that talks about this idea that it's not just a matter that you have to have mutations that change things. There have to be changes in there that are positive, and the positive ones have to be so frequent that they overrule the degrading ones. And it turns out that random change actually degrades the vast majority of the time, and it doesn't lead to a benefit. And the reason has to do with information, which we'll look at in another section here. But you can't just ravage information and get better information from it. Also, the survival of the fittest cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. So, in order to have something that's selected out and is going to survive better than its peers, it has to have characteristics that are significantly better, that are not only inherited, but they have to be ones that cause it to stand out in the selection process. So to get to that point to even be selected is a problem. And as I mentioned here just in passing, there are characteristics that mutations provide that don't provide any survival benefit, and then there's those that do provide survival benefit, but they're not necessarily inherited. And then this is another big one. The earliest life forms in the fossil record exhibit complex and varied body plans and advanced functions such as the trilobite eye. So the standard story of biological evolution is that simple things that are very similar spread off into branches, and the branches have a lot of similarity to start with, and then over time they diverge and they get more complex to where they're actually, the animals that are up on the branches of this development are significantly different. You end up with things like a starfish versus a bird, right? But if you look in the earliest life forms that are captured in the fossil record, they already have tremendously different body plans. It's not like minor differences, their whole body plans are different. Plus, you have these advanced functions that shouldn't be there, that are supposedly really sophisticated and would take an enormous amount of evolutionary time to come about, like the trilobite eye. And those are all in this very early stages of the fossil record. So how does that happen? How do you explain that? So this is a book I'd suggest that you might want to consider reading if you haven't read it yet. It's called Darwin's Doubt: The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design, written by Stephen Meyer, who's a very influential scientist in the field of looking at the causes of how animals came to be. And this book is rated 4.7 out of 5 after over 1,800 reviews on Amazon. So this isn't some fly-by-night odd book by some strange person. This is a real solid work that if you're serious about investigating this question for yourself, I encourage you to take a look at this book. So here's another thing that many people don't realize is they always say, well, look, evolution is a proven fact, and all the scientists know it's a fact, so what's wrong with you guys who are skeptics? Well, there's a website called DescentFromDarwin.org, and you'll find there a claim that's been signed by over 1,000 PhD scientists. In fact, there were over 1,000 back a decade ago. I'm sure it's in quite a bit larger number now. But the claim that they're signing, or the statement they're signing, reads as follows: "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged." Is that the case in our schools, in the media? No, of course it's not. But it's been signed by over 1,000 PhD scientists worldwide, many of them coming from scientific disciplines directly related to the questions that we're talking about. So it isn't true that every scientist knows that evolution is a fact. So that's miracle number 4. Secular miracle number 4 is evolution from goo to you via the zoo. It's never been observed, can't be replicated, can't be studied scientifically, or when it is studied in ways that are minor, using high-speed different kinds of bacteria and stuff that replicate really quickly in petri dishes and so forth. People still aren't getting very far. So I'm going to call that miracle number 4. So let's move on now to miracle number 5, the last of the secular miracles that I want to cover today. This one is the origin of information by chance. And this has to do with things that Darwin couldn't know and didn't know. So what Darwin didn't know is that all biological systems are highly complex, and depending they depend upon sophisticated information systems to function. So the idea that life arises by chance and then evolves by chance, at the end of the whole story, in the point of life where we are now, when we look into the cell, at the DNA, into the proteins and what it takes for proteins to form, and etc., how RNA and DNA works, and other aspects of the cell that are way beyond me, they're super complex, and they don't just happen by accident. There's programming, there's codes and sequences and information, just like the codes in DNA, that allow them to do what they do. So the $1,000 question then is, where did that information come from? And how does information arise? And where do we see information? How do we know something is information and it's not information? So how did the information arise? Well, evolution's answer is information arose naturally through unguided natural processes, primarily mutation and natural selection. And it just took a long time. And the reason we can't show that it occurs now is that we don't have enough time. Well, I want to point out that makes it then a theory, because if you can't demonstrate it and it's not subject to scientific investigation, then it's not really a testable hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis. It's just a suggestion. So to get at the heart of this, just an example to get you to think about this a little bit is, consider whether randomness can write a program. And here I'm even given the benefit of not writing a complete program from scratch, but just modifying a program. That'd be a lot easier, wouldn't it? So let's start with Microsoft Word. So, and we don't even need the source code for Microsoft Word. We just can take the binary code, the executable that runs on your computer, which is produced by a compiler and assembler and all this. So you just have a big blob, a binary object that has all these ones and zeros. But the ones and zeros are arranged in an incredibly complex, sophisticated way. And when they're interpreted with certain tools that are also very complex and sophisticated, it runs the Microsoft Word program on your computer. So you can search for words, you can edit words, you can insert characters, you can format paragraphs. All of that depends on the sequence of ones and zeros, the bits and the pattern of bits that are in the binary for Microsoft Word. So we give you a head start. We give you Microsoft Word fully functioning. And now your job is to randomly pick a bit somewhere in the program at random, right? It's an unguided process. So you have to pick a bit somewhere in the program. You got to flip it. If it's a 1, you flip it to a 0. If it's a 0, you flip it to a 1. And then you check the program to see if it works better or worse than it used to work. And when it works better, it has to work better enough that you can distinguish there was a benefit in some way. And that, that's the whole point of natural selection and survival of the fittest, right? Anyway, you randomly fit a bit, and then you check the program now, and you see if it performs the functions of Microsoft Excel, which is a spreadsheet, right? It's not the word processor, it's the spreadsheet. Of course, Microsoft Excel is very complicated as well. So you got Microsoft Word, you flip a bit, you see if it works like Microsoft Excel. It doesn't. So you flip another bit somewhere else at random. You do it again. You flip another bit, you do it again. You flip another bit, you do it again. And I hope you can see the two questions you have to face here is, how long will it take? And will the process ever converge to produce Excel? And I'm going to answer, how long will it take? Forever. Will it ever converge to produce Excel? No. And the reason has to do with the fact that as you're flipping the bits, you are damaging the genetic code, you're damaging the code for Microsoft Word, and the program is actually becoming non-functional or broken in various ways. And so the question then comes up is, if you consider Microsoft Word to be kind of an island in information space where it's a highly functional tool that works, and you've got Microsoft Excel as another island in information space at a far distance island, and in between them is a sea of possibilities where you flip bits. And the question is, can the animal that's Microsoft Word flip bits and make its way across that ocean to the island of information that's Excel without perishing along the way? And I'm going to say the answer is no, it will perish, because the two functional islands are so sophisticated and specified in the complexity of information that randomness cannot get you from one place to the other. It's like lemmings trying to cross a continent where there's all these different cliffs in between. Somewhere along the way, the lemming's going to fall off a cliff. So when we look at information, it's really the death knell to chance. In fact, information and chance are two opposites. Chance cannot produce information, and information is the antithesis of chance. You've heard of the signal-to-noise ratio used in communication. Well, the signal is the information, and the noise is the chance that's caused by processes that are in the background. And the whole point of communication is to extract the signal from the noise. The noise is the randomness, the signal is the intelligence or the information. And what we know from communication theory and from studies of information theory is that complex information of specific complexity has only one known source. It's only ever seen when there's a mind behind it. A mind produces the information. And so what we conclude, this is a law of information. And why I say it's a law, it hasn't been demonstrated to ever not occur. So it's as much of a law as the first law of thermodynamics, that information that's pre-specified of a certain complexity can never occur apart from a mind. And so when you see information, it's evidence that there was a mind here. At some point, a mind intervened. So like an example would be that information requires design. And so once you have a mind behind the information, that infers design, and of course that infers a designer. And of course, evolutionists, if you're a materialist, you can't have a designer, so you got to keep that camel's nose out of the tent. So consider, for example, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And this is an interesting thing to consider, because people who are in SETI are often evolutionists who believe that life evolved. Evolution is just so powerful that life evolved all over the place in the universe. So there's got to be life forms out there that we haven't heard from. So how do they go about determining and searching for this intelligence, extraterrestrial intelligence? Well, I submit to you, they're looking for evidence of information. They're looking for patterns. They're looking for signals, and they're looking for signals that can't be generated by randomness. And so they're telling you, when they're doing SETI, what they're telling you is that randomness can't produce information, because once they find information, they're going to use it to argue there's intelligence, not randomness. So when does randomness become unconvincing as an explanation for something you see? And of course, that's kind of a vague thing to determine, but I want to illustrate it a little bit with two different kind of thought experiments or things to think about. The first one is, let's take a coin and let's flip it 100 times. And assuming it's a perfect coin where it perfectly evenly lands on a head or a tail, you go ahead and flip it 100 times, and each time it lands on a head, you write down an H on your piece of paper, and each time it lands on a tail, you write a T. And as you flip this coin, you have two possibilities, a head or a tail. And so as you write this down and you flip it 100 times, you're going to get a sequence of 100 H's and T's in a certain variation. And every single time you flip that coin, randomness is going to produce a highly unspecified but unique series of heads and tails. And that series of heads and tails is very hard to replicate. So if you flip it 100 times and you come up with a sequence, and I say to you, okay, I want you to stay here all day, keep flipping the coin at 100 at a time, and write down the sequences, and then call me back up when you get the same sequence twice in a row. Well, this is a binary thing, so each time you flip it, there's a 50-50 chance, or 1 and 2. Flip it 100 times, I think it's 2 to 100 is the probability you would get the same sequence. You're going to be flipping that coin for your entire life, and you're never going to see that same sequence again. Okay, so that just demonstrates that randomness can produce very improbable things, right? The sequence is very improbable, and every time you flip a set of 100, you're going to get a super improbable sequence, but it's not going to be the same sequence. So now the question is, once we bring specified complexity, that's the idea that it's not just any old sequence, it has to be a specific sequence. That's going to change the equation. And so to illustrate that, I want to talk about another experiment I've done in Bible studies before, which I collect some black and white pebbles off of the beach. So the idea here is that you're walking a trail, a hiking trail, and you come to a fork in the trail, and the trail leads in 2 directions, and you're not really sure, well, which way am I supposed to go? But you look down on the trail at your feet, and there's a white rock and a couple of black rocks, pebbles down there. Well, that doesn't give you any clue which way you're supposed to go on the trail. And you look at the rocks, and you're looking for a sign. You're looking for some sort of sign, right? A sign that will indicate which way to go. And the little pebbles you see down there could have just rolled out there, or been disturbed or knocked there by a passing animal or whatever. So it's, there's a chance explanation, so you don't give any heed to those pebbles. But what happens now if the pebbles, more pebbles are there, and the pebbles are in a pattern? So I've demonstrated this in classes before, where I bring these white and dark pebbles, and I put a few down on a table, and I ask people, well, is this significant? What is this? And they say, well, I don't know, it's just some rocks. So over time, what you do is you add more pebbles in a pre-specified arrangement, and you create an arrow, right? So you eventually create an arrow where what if the tail of the arrow, or the main part of the arrow, has alternating black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white, never breaks out of that pattern. And then at the head of the arrow, it's all black rocks, but no white ones. And then in the middle of the outline of the head of the arrow, there's all white rocks and no black ones. So what I've seen, and this is always the case when you do this as a demonstration with people, you get partway along placing the rocks in this specified complexity, and somewhere along the line, somebody says, hey, that's an arrow. That's information. It's telling me something. It's pointing. It's not just random. So my point here is that everything in life is that way. When we see things that are highly unlikely, they can have a chance explanation, or they can have an intelligent explanation, and it has to do with the specified complexity and the function that it has, and whether it can be recognized as something that's not random, essentially. And we all have this random detector built into us. So if we're walking that hiking trail and we come along and we see an arrow with black, white, black, white, black, and a black outline on the head with white in the middle, and somebody were to ask, well, which way are we supposed to go on the trail? You would say that those stones are telling us which way to go. They are containing and conveying information. And if I were to say to you, well, did they just randomly show up like that? You would say, no way are they random. There's an intelligence behind it that produced that arrow. And not only that, the arrow is conveying information. It's not random. Random chance can't produce that arrow, or it's so unlikely. And this function is important because there's a fork in the trail. You know that it isn't random. And that's the case when we look into biological systems and inside the cell. So here's a book that explores the mathematics behind this idea of probability and also specified complexity. And it's called The Design Inference. It's been out for quite a while. This is the second edition by William Dembski, who's a mathematician and philosopher, and Winston Ewart, who's involved with software development, and I think he's a professor as well. And the subtitle is entitled Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities. So it's this whole idea of looking at the area of mathematics and not just looking at whether something is highly improbable, but how do you eliminate the potential that it was produced by chance, and conclude that it must have come from intelligence and not from chance. And if it came from an intelligence, what's the only source of intelligence we know of? It's a mind. The information came from intelligence, which was a mind. And so on the picture of the book, notice that they have Mount Rushmore, and that's not by accident. And the point of having Mount Rushmore on the book is there's at least two different ways to explain how Mount Rushmore came to be. One explanation, which is the equivalent of evolutionary biology, is there was solid rock wall there, and over time, through unguided natural processes, of course they would say it's not quite the same because natural selection, etc., but the idea is that there's no intelligence involved in how those faces came to be. It was just erosion and some factors that operated with erosion, and over time out popped the faces of these famous presidents. Of course, the alternate explanation, which everybody knows is the case, is that those faces were designed and chiseled and exploded, and it was an art form, and it's a reflection of intelligence. And if there were any alien life out there, and it looks down on Earth with its most powerful telescopes or abilities to fly by and take a look, they're going to conclude that that is intelligence. That is what SETI is looking for, things like that. If those faces showed up on the moon or on Mars, you better believe SETI would be all over it. And so that's the point of this book is, well, how do we look at things and determine whether they're really improbable, and more than that they're improbable, but also in a way that rules out chance as a possible explanation. So I would refer you to this book, and that is more focused on the mathematical side of things. There's another book by Stephen Meyer that's also excellent called Signature in the Cell, and this is now looking at biological information systems within the cell, RNA, DNA, the different codes that are there, and making the case that each cell in all life forms contains a signature, if you will, a signature of an intellect, and that signature of the intellect is the information that's in the cell. And notice this one is rated 4.8 out of 5 on Amazon. It's been reviewed thousands of times. It's well worth a read. If you're interested in this, taking it further, I would recommend both these books. So what does evolution do when it's faced with the mathematical realities? And we haven't even discussed another area, which is the fine-tuning of the universe, where constants in the universe are so finely adjusted in their value, if you will, to allow certain things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And without them being tweaked just the way they are, there would be no life. And that's a whole other area we haven't looked at. But what happens there is there's also this idea of mathematics. There's mathematics that shows that the potential for this to be true is extremely improbable. So improbable, it's equivalent to impossible. So the mathematics shows that unguided natural processes can't produce information, not in highly complex specified patterns. So what does evolution in the secular worldview do? It's an escape from reality. They put forth, the multiverse. And why do they put forth the multiverse? Well, the idea is if you take the known age of the universe, you take the known number of atoms in the universe, it doesn't provide enough material and enough time to do the probabilistic experiments or variations to allow for the chance that's needed to produce these sophisticated systems. There's not enough probabilistic material or resources in the known universe to provide what's needed for unguided processes to produce this stuff. So then they say, well, we must live in a multiverse. So what they're trying to do now is escape from the reality of the universe and say that, well, there's an infinite number of multiverses, or infinite number of universes, a multiverse, and therefore now we have a lot more probabilistic resources, so that we could say that this is just the one in a zillion, billion, zillion chance, and we happen to live in that universe. I want to point out to you that that's not science. It's an untestable hypothesis. At its very core, it invalidates the very concept of what a universe is. A universe is all that there is. You can't just posit things outside the universe. That's a meta-narrative that goes beyond science. And notice that the whole idea of the multiverse is untestable. And if you look on the internet, you'll see lots of articles that talk about the fact that it's not science. So the multiverse doesn't really get you what you want, other than you don't want to face information, so you got to find something else. And so now that's all the rage, the multiverse. So I want to say to you that the arisal of information from non-information by chance is secular miracle number 5. It's an event that's not explicable by natural or scientific laws. So what we've seen here in our survey of these worldviews, and we haven't looked at the biblical one much, but I've summarized it as I have here. My main point is that the secular worldview, which is said to be objective, real, science, fact, is based on core miracles, just like the biblical worldview. They both require miracles. So the representation of the secular worldview as being rational and not depending on miracles is patently false. And the representation of it as being true science in the biblical worldview, which requires miracles not being science, is an oversimplification and a misrepresentation of truth. Both worldviews depend upon miracles. The secular worldview depends on, number one, the origin of space-time, possibly by quantum fluctuation, but then that's something from nothing already. Number two, it requires cosmic inflation, where, guess what? Things travel way quicker than the speed of light. Have we ever seen anything break the speed of light? Does mathematics show that the speed of light doesn't hold? No, it breaks the laws. It's a miracle. Then we have life from non-life. Never been observed, hasn't been produced, even with all the intelligence of man over 70 years, focused on making it happen and trying to come up with ways to allow these things to self-assemble. It doesn't happen. It hasn't been shown to happen. It's a miracle. It can't be demonstrated. It breaks the laws we know. Biological evolution, another miracle that has never been demonstrated, not the zoo to you via the goo kind of evolution, which includes number 5, the origin of complex information by chance. That again, mathematics shows is impossible. And so those are the 5 secular miracles. Of course, the biblical account has many miracles, similar ones. Creation from nothing, where God, outside of time, created the universe. The virgin birth is another example, where God came in human as a child, was born into the world in the person of Jesus Christ. The virgin birth, you don't see that every day. That's a miracle. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a miracle. Prophecy, the Bible's predicting the future. That's something science can't touch at all. That's miraculous. And then there's many other miracles. But the thing about the biblical view is it's more honest that, yeah, it requires miracles. And then number 2, it's proposing the only known source of these things. Information, the only known source is a mind. What is the biblical view for what's behind the information? A mind. The same for creation from something from nothing. The same thing of creation from life from non-life. How did that happen? God picked up the dust and created Adam and then blew his life into it. So we say that a divine intelligence created or bridged that material but non-living to living gap, was bridged by this super intellect and his intervention. So I think if you're objective at all, you've got to admit that both worldviews depend upon miracles. So some closing questions to consider as we wrap things up. If both views require belief in unobservable and unprovable events, that is, miracles, why is one promoted in public school and the other prohibited? Another question. Why is one worldview considered rational and scientific and the other one's considered irrational and a fairy tale? Why is there this uneven playing field? If it's really true that the secular worldview is built on a series of miracles, then why is it the one that gets all the airtime and the biblical worldview gets shunted off into a different realm of faith or, whatever? You can do it in private schools. Don't be doing that in our public schools. So why is that uneven playing field? Well, the Bible suggests that there's a bias at work. And that bias has to do with anthropology, which is the study of the nature of man. That man enters the world with a bias against truth. Notice this verse from the book of Romans. Men suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So it says here that the truth is evident in the world around us, and that's through many of the things we've talked about. If the secular worldview requires this whole series of miracles, isn't that evidence that there is a miracle maker that's providing these significant events that can't be produced and can't be shown, that they break the laws of nature? There is a nature, someone who created nature, nature's maker, who can tweak nature at times when it's his desire. And so, since creation, his invisible attributes are seen, being understood by the creation. So the creation witnesses, the things we're looking at, witnesses to this super intellect. And so the Bible says that men are without excuse. They know that that's true, but they suppress it. And it says here that they become futile in their thoughts, and their hearts are darkened. Even though they profess to be wise, many of them are PhDs and doctorates, teaching at universities, but the Bible says they became fools. They're so bent in rejecting God that they can't see straight. We also see this in the book of John. This is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest their deeds should be exposed. So there's the fundamental. This is the most important element in the two worldviews, the difference in the two worldviews. There's lots of differences that we looked at, but the most important one is, what is the nature of man? Is man just another animal, or is man created in God's image? Is man born good or neutral, or is man born in sin? And I submit to you, man is born in sin, and so he is unwilling to see the evidence for God behind the scenes, and even in the things of nature, hummingbirds, butterflies, on and on we could go. They're very sophisticated, complex systems, and to look at them and say that they came by chance is absolute insanity. And yet, by professing to be wise, when we reject God, we become fools. So I hope this has been an interesting discussion, and if you're someone who is biased against the biblical worldview, I hope that this will give you pause to think twice and dig a little deeper. Look at some of those resources I recommended. This area is an area that was part of what led me from being a committed evolutionist to a biblical creationist, and led me from being a skeptic to a born-again Christian over 30 years ago. So my prayer is that it might help you in that same transition, that you might see the truth and no longer suppress it in unrighteousness.